Imagine if violence wasn't the end of the story. Imagine if we could find a way through all the soul-crushing chaos and division of the past year. Imagine if we lived like we belonged to each other. If we refused to be enemies with those who are different, with those we disagree with, those we've been told to fear, or those we just don't understand. Imagine if we could press into pain, if we could take one step toward whatever scares us most and choose to love anyway. Imagine if we truly believed that the greatest act of love is to lay our lives down instead of clinging to them so tightly that we suffocate all the joy out of life. Imagine if our love could reach into some of the hardest, most forsaken places on earth. Syria, Iraq, North Korea, and even where we live. Imagine if the Middle East was no longer a byword for destruction and despair, but a monument of hope. Imagine if ISIS or Kim Jong-un were a footnote to the real story. The story of a love that steps across enemy lines, heals every wound, binds up every broken heart. Imagine if the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible didn't just live in our hearts. Imagine if we started building it with our refugee friends in Iraq, with our displaced friends in Syria, with brothers and sisters in the countryside of North Korea, and with our neighbors right at home. The more beautiful world is more than just our imagination. It's made real when we show up on the front lines, when we stand together and choose a love powerful enough to unmake violence. Join us as we turn our imagination into reality. Good morning. Greetings from the people of Iraq and Syria. That's where we live. We live in Iraq. We've been there 10 years, and we'll share some of the story about how we got there over our time together this morning. But it's been an honor to be with you. Thanks for sharing your space and your homes and your family with us. Why don't you start back at the beginning? How did we end up sitting in a room like this some 17 years ago? What was that first step? What was that first catalyzing moment that you remember that kind of got us down this journey to where we now live and work where we do?
Well, I remember very well the morning of September 11th, 2001. We had just been married a few months and both just had our 22nd birthday. And I arrived at work in a church where I worked, and everyone was just frozen and fixated on the television screen because an airplane had just flown into one of the World Trade Centers. And that moment became a catalyst for what would be the rest of our lives personally, and really, I think, a shift in perspective and thinking for Americans, the church, and most of what would happen over the next years in the world. And I remember just being stunned. Like, we just graduated university, we just got married, and we had this whole life in front of us, and all of a sudden the world is different. Everything's flipped upside down and nothing feels safe anymore. And so we turned to our pastors and our friends to try and understand what's our next move, what should we do next. And over the years, I've been so grateful that we were part of a faith community that encouraged us to love deeper and follow the way of Jesus and the words of Jesus to love our enemies. And that night, we were invited to someone's home to pray for Osama bin Laden. The rest of our country had turned on the war machine, and we were being invited into a living room to pray for the one that everyone else was targeting. And that wisdom and that posture to get on our knees and pray for our enemy, it changed the trajectory of our life forever.
Yeah, I remember, I'm a musician and I was leading worship a lot on stages like this back at that time. And it felt like one of those rubber meets the road kind of moments where it's hard to stand on stage and sing, "Our lives belong to you, God. We will follow wherever you say go. We want to follow Jesus. The grave has no grip on us." It's hard to stand in front of people who you see singing back to you those things and throwing their hands in the air. It's hard to stand in that position and in a moment like that and not be challenged and called deeper into like really counting the cost of, do I believe what I'm leading all these people to echo back to me, to sing out to God? Do I really believe that the grave has no grip on us, on our family right now, in the face of this terrorism, in the face of what's going on in the world? And slowly through that moment of prayer, we raised our hand and volunteered to go. The way the conversation was emerging in the American context at that time, I guess there were two or three streams of response. One was the military response. If you want to see terrorism obliterated, then you have to go bomb it out of existence. The other response was like a certain brand of missionary response, and then maybe the third was just to kind of bury your head in the sand and pretend that there was nothing wrong. So we raised our hand to respond and ended up moving overseas. And I remember I had very much styled myself in the posture of like an Apostle Paul. I was an argumentative young man. I knew how to use words to engage in argument and try to convince people of my way of seeing things. I had gone to seminary. So at 24 years old when we moved overseas, I pretty much knew everything. I'd read 30 books or so in seminary, and that was enough. We didn't have kids when we moved overseas. I was an awesome dad. And we landed in this Muslim country, ready to tell a bunch of old people and parents and peers alike how they needed to change their life. We were 24 years old, but we knew Jesus. And because we knew Jesus, that's all we needed to know. And when I say we, this is especially true of me. I would go about the neighborhood and try to wage war with my words in many ways. Muslims were the problem. I knew the answer. And I would go everywhere I would go and try to convince people to give up everything they'd ever known about their life and just join me in following Jesus. Reject everything that had ever been a part of their culture and just accept Jesus. And I remember, as you might imagine, it wasn't a very effective strategy. It turns out that Muslims, just like us, they don't take kindly to being told, rudely what to do and what's wrong with their life by 24-year-old hotheads. And we had gone to a conference with some other fellow people, church planters and the like, and we've been in the country a couple of years now. We've been trying to do this work, trying to do the work of evangelism and planting churches, and we were at a conference that was meant to just stoke us further in that work and in that way. And there were people on stage telling amazing stories and telling about the fruit of their life and their ministry, and I was just kind of sitting there brooding and seething because God wasn't doing anything through me. God wasn't bearing any fruit through us. And we had a breakout time of prayer, and I just went off by myself and got face down on the ground in prayer. I was just so humbled and angry at what was going on. And I remember it was a rug just like this, actually. And I get down on my face in prayer, and I'm bent over just crying out to God, "Where are you, Lord? Why aren't you doing anything through us? I'm a great language learner. I know how to make all the right evangelistic arguments. We're doing everything right. We've studied the church planting process, and you're doing something through that guy? And you're using that woman? Like, she doesn't even speak the language very well. And I'm so smart. I'm so smart, God. Why aren't you doing anything through us? And in this very profound moment, I heard a response. Maybe the only time I would say I heard, but I heard. And the voice, the response said, I'm face down crying out to God. It's because you don't love them, Jeremy. You love being right. You love being thought well of. You love being thought that you're smart. But you don't love Muhammad, the guy at the coffee shop sitting on the other side of the table from you, for who he is, full stop. You love Muhammad, the guy who used to be a Muslim, because you showed up on the scene and made him a Christian. But you don't love the guy sitting in front of you right now today. It's because you don't love them, Jeremy. And in that moment, face down on that carpet in prayer in that hotel in Turkey, I saw myself in my mind's eye with my fist up. I'm arguing to God. I'm crying out to God. Why aren't you doing anything through me? And I'm in this aggressive posture of fighting and warfare. Warring with God, but also warring with everyone around me. And when that word came, because you don't love them, Jeremy, it was like the fire of heaven just came down and melted the ice around my heart. And in my aggressive, fighting posture, my fist, in my mind's eye, I saw my fist just lower and open up into a posture of love, open up into a posture of welcome. And though I was still face down on the ground in the real world in prayer, as I stood up from that carpet, I was a completely, instantaneously changed person. It wasn't a process. It wasn't some long journey of sanctification. It was in a moment, in a flash. I went from fist up looking for a fight to arms wide looking for welcome, looking to give welcome, looking to extend hospitality. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, it was a pretty incredible transformation, and it changed everything about who we are and the way that we would walk forward. And since that day, as people have read Scripture and as I have been back in reading the words of Jesus, it is incredible to me how often Jesus tells us to love, and I missed it. Because we came out of a background that was very maybe high-minded and conversion-driven, that we had missed how many times Jesus told us to love, that it is his commandment that we love one another, and the love that we were trying to give, the way that we interpreted that was how smart we could be with our words, rather than the actual act of laying Jesus lived it out before us, and somehow we missed it, of laying ourselves down to love the people around us. And that happened while we were still living in Turkey, and it allowed us to walk out of Turkey into Iraq completely different people who could become a people that welcomed whatever God put in front of us and saw our mandate from God to be one of loving the person standing right in front of us for who they were right in that moment.
You had an experience pretty early on after we moved to Iraq that I guess gave us a chance to begin practicing that for the first. Who knows what we missed during the 3 years we lived in Turkey? It's kind of sad to think about. Who knows what was going on around us? We just weren't awake to it. Our eyes were open. We were walking down the street, but we didn't see. I guess we didn't see the need around us. I think when we moved into Iraq, maybe just because we thought of it as such a war-torn country, we'd seen headline news about it. It so predominated the American landscape because there were so many hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, our friends who were fighting and dying in Iraq. Maybe that sense of what the country was already started, I guess, softening the ground of our heart a little bit toward physical needs, and maybe slightly started reorienting us away from a disembodied sort of soul versus the body and the world around us. But what do you remember about that very first catalytic sort of human physical needs encounter that really started leading us down the road to that video that now has taken us to so many different places doing more of that kind of work?
Yeah. So if you were here yesterday, you heard that I kind of pushed us to go ahead and move into Iraq after Jeremy was the only one who had seen it. I said, no, we can do this. I can do the no electricity, the no water thing. I can raise our 18-month-old there, no problem. It's going to be easy. It wasn't easy. It was so difficult. And it wasn't until I stepped out of my house, even though it was uncomfortable, I wanted to stay there. It wasn't until I stepped out of that we began to encounter people around us. And one day I was standing in the bazaar and I'm holding Emma. Thankfully, she was a very small baby. And it's so hot outside, and I've learned from other expats around us to look for a taxi that has the windows rolled up, because that means it has air conditioning inside. And so it's like the reprieve after you've been in a hot bazaar all day. And I start to flag this taxi coming to me, and it's perfect. It's exactly what I want. And he drives by with someone already in the taxi, and the one right behind him is the oldest taxi in the city. The windows are rolled down. It's rusty on the outside. I don't even know if it can actually get me to my house. But I feel guilty by this point because this man has pulled over for me. And rather than telling him to go on and wait for the next nice taxi, I get in. And immediately he turns around and he says, "Are you American?" And I said, "Yes." And he's like, "Good, good." And he starts taking off, and I tell him where I live, and he's going the opposite direction. And I'm trying to, text people and say, like, I'm going somewhere that's not home. But he's smiley. He seems really friendly. He seems happy that I'm an American. And so Emma and I continue on with this man. And he drives a bit outside of the city to a neighborhood that's very obviously impoverished. And he pulls up next to this gate, and his wife opens the gate and extends this huge welcome to us to come inside. And I walk into the house, which is like 2 rooms. The first small room is a kitchen, and then I walk into the next room, which is just a living room with carpets and pillows on the floor. And there's about a 7-year-old girl laying on the ground. And they tell me her name is Seema. And I don't understand very much language at this point, but I was raised by a mom who works with children with different abilities, and I see this child on the ground, and I know immediately that she has cerebral palsy. And the parents have no idea what to do with her. She doesn't have any of the therapy stuff in the room that I would expect of a family who has a child like this. And I can just see that they don't know what to do. And so I sit on the floor with Seema, and I set Emma down, and I'm trying to talk with the family about what her needs are. And I know that I have to come back. So I leave, he takes us home, and I return later on that week with one of our teammates who was a physical therapist, and we brought a stroller for Seema that we'd spent the week like sewing foam and special straps to this stroller so that it would be adaptable for her, so that this child could sit up for the first time in her life. And we go back, and she begins physical therapy with her, and we put her in the wheelchair, and she can go outside without being in her parents' arms for the first time. And I realized in that moment that our role in loving people was to open windows and doors for them and give access so that people could succeed on their own.
I don't remember exactly what it was like that night after you got kidnapped. But I can imagine what I was like. I can imagine that I was still detoxing from certain elements of who and how I was thinking. And I can imagine that at least my impulse, I wasn't argumentative and looking for a fight in the same way that I had previously been. But but I hadn't yet fully experienced, I hadn't experienced what you would experience now in waking up more and more to the physical needs around us. This was really one of the first moments. And I can imagine that at least my impulse, if I didn't say it out loud, at least my impulse in that moment would have been to say, so did you tell him about Jesus? Can you remember back to that moment? Can you remember back to what you were thinking? Can you remember back to the calculus that went on in your head about how to think about someone with a congenital affliction and how to help, how you saw her as someone who had not just some suffering, but like a different set of abilities waiting to be unlocked, and how you thought about whether this was something you should speak into and heal her in Jesus' name, or whether you should take a more practicable approach of offering tools and assistance, like theologically, practically, logistically. How did you think about that? Because it ended up leading us in a different place, and we haven't talked about it in a long time. I just wonder if that might be helpful for someone here today.
I think this happens a lot in families like ours, where the husband has a very defined thing that he goes out and does every day, and a wife can often be at home with young children, which is a really hard stage in life, and just kind of feel like your entire life is consumed by that child. My life had started feeling like that, and I think there was a purpose that I was looking for, and Seema and other children like her began to fill that purpose. But it did, at a point, start to come into conflict with your grant writing position, where, because it required something of our team to rethink and re-engage the way of what our life was going to be in Iraq. And I just think that Seema was a small step of saying yes to a different way of life. And so if you had been there from the beginning to follow our organization's life, it looked like children with different abilities needing physical therapy, and then children who needed life-saving heart surgeries, and then ISIS comes on the scene and we're delivering aid, and from aid we start working in development and trying to help people start jobs. And it was just a couple of months ago, standing in our office, that someone called from the States, someone who was a mentor of ours, who's been following our journey for a long time, and he was like, guys, I cannot connect the dots of what you're doing here. Like, there's no straight line. Just you studied physical science, and Jeremy, you studied business, and here we've gone in this really crazy, wavy thing that I've now come to myself see as like this river that God has been creating with our lives. But this guy, he was like, is this some kind of mission creep? Like, can you guys not figure out who you are and what you're supposed to be doing? And after that conversation, as Jeremy and I were talking, I just realized that this isn't mission creep at all. This is God's goodness in our lives to take us step by step into the place that he wants us to be. And I don't tell this story a lot, but we were in Turkey for the first couple of years and learned Turkish. And we moved into Iraq. That Turkish was almost completely pointless, except that I had an 18-month-old daughter, and I needed to know what I was putting in her mouth every day. And when I went to the grocery store, all of the groceries were brought in from Turkey, and I could read every ingredient in the food that I was feeding my daughter. How kind is that? And so and then to be raised by a mom who works with differently abled children, and the first child I come into contact with is someone that I can understand who she is without being able to understand what her parents are saying. And it's just been, then Jeremy met this little girl who needed a heart surgery in a hotel lobby, and he said yes, not believing and promising the parents that we could not help them. We didn't know anything about medicine. We didn't know anything about doctors. He comes home. We decide to help. It takes 3 phone calls for us to have access to someone who can help change her life forever. And it's just this beautiful river of step by step being willing to say, I don't know how to do this, but I trust that God has put this person in front of me, and so I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to walk alongside them and see what comes next, that has led us to this now incredible story of what you've seen on the screen of being able to have a positive effect on entire economies and cities and groups of people around us.
We organized this work that you were doing with little girls like Seema, the work that we were doing with kids who needed these life-saving surgeries. We sort of organized all that into an organization called Preemptive Love Coalition under this umbrella, this idea, really a philosophy, a posture that we call preemptive love. After we met some people in Iraq, some soldiers in Iraq, and certainly the terrorists in Iraq were embodying this idea, and the militias in Iraq were embodying this idea that could be summed up as saying, shoot first, ask questions later. I mean, people were saying it out loud. A lot more people were living it without actually saying it out loud. Shoot first, ask questions later. One guy said to me, kill them all, let God sort it out. One girl soldier said, yeah, it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And I came home and shared some of these mantras that I was hearing with Jessica early on in our days in Iraq. And it was so ill-fitting for us. I mean, we had already lowered our fists. We had already been transformed, but we hadn't yet fully taken that next step into transformation, the next stage of transformation. And in the face of this, I mean, we wanted to protect ourselves. Iraq was scary. I mean, there were kidnappings happening, suicide bombings, drive-by shootings on our streets, and we were definitely oriented toward wanting to protect ourselves. My very first moments in Iraq, a friend threw a bulletproof jacket over my head and ducked me into the back of his bulletproof car. That was my initial engagement in Iraq, was to be afraid, to hide behind walls, and to be as protected as I could be. But it wasn't following Jesus. Like, it didn't feel like the Jesus way. It was hard to see that self-protectionistic way in the Jesus life and in the Jesus story. And it came to this kind of fork in the road moment for us where our options were, do we want to be particularly decidedly American and belong to that tribe and belong to that way and orient ourselves in that self-protectionistic manner, or do we want to belong to a different system altogether? Do we want to belong to a different government altogether? Do we want to pay allegiance to a different head of government, a different king, different president altogether? And the way of Jesus kept calling us forward until we ultimately just said, what if we're supposed to be a people who love first and ask questions later? What if our questions are getting all jumbled up in our head and it's actually making us unable to love? What if it's like we're supposed to not worry about whether we love the wrong person? Like, we knew people who seemed seriously concerned that they could love too much. Like, what if I love a bad guy? What if I love the enemy? What if I show love and support in this community and they end up being terrorists? And so, out of an abundance of caution, we would all withhold our love, because we wouldn't want to blanket it on the bad guys. And so we started saying, well, what if we're just meant to love them all and let God sort it out? Be lavish and liberal in love. What if there's actually something worth living for so much that our main concern, our main priority would not be, oh my goodness, how can I not end up dead in a coffin being carried to my grave? What if there was something worth dying for, worth moving into danger, pressing into pain? And so we just decided we call it blackmail ourselves, paint ourselves into a corner by branding all of our life and our work and our family under this name, preemptive love. We would forever be told that we are a people who have to jump forward to love you before you do anything to love us. That we're supposed to serve you before you do anything to get us. And that has ended up being a very fortuitous, providential, I think, moment in our life to brand ourselves preemptive love. It was always meant to point to Jesus. It was always meant to say, this is the Jesus way of living. But I guess saying Christianity has gotten kind of stale. I guess even saying Jesus follower has gotten kind of bland, because as I look out among all my friends and family, it doesn't seem like anyone is taking Jesus very seriously. We're singing songs and we're reading the scripture and we're doing the devotions, but it doesn't seem to be leading us forward in love. What do you remember about that fork in the road when ISIS sprang on the scene in such a big way, boiled up from inside Iraq, came across the border from Syria? You know, they controlled territory, about a third of Syria, about a third of Iraq, and just now had created this new state they called the Caliphate. What do you remember about the challenge that put to us in that moment, where we had up until that point been this love first, ask questions later, and now suddenly all the threat and fear of the world was bearing down on us in a really big way? What do you remember about that time?
Well, I think for the world, Iraq got really scary in 2014. But for our family, Iraq got really scary in 2013. Because that's when this guy who was a friend and brother of ours just came after us. He called other tribes to come and try and kill us. He tried to take our children out of school. He had us arrested and put in jail from lies. They took our passports. There were all of these court cases opened against us. There was one point in time when Jeremy walked into the government offices with every file that we had and just set the file boxes on their desk and said, "It's all yours. We have nothing to hide. Just take it all, comb through it all. You won't find anything about us." And we were just coming out of that when ISIS came on the scene. So we were pretty raw, pretty broken, and just trying to keep walking this thing forward. And then all of a sudden, all of the people that we knew in Mosul and part of, a third of our country had been overtaken by this terrorist group, and we had a decision to make. We had two really big decisions to make at that point in time. We had been living out this preemptive love thing through heart surgeries, bringing surgeons and nurses over to Iraq. Most of that work was funded by the Iraq government, and it had been amazing up to that point. But now the government needed to focus all of their spending on fighting ISIS and not paying the organizations back for the work that was being done as they had done previously. And then the second question was, were we going to cling to being a heart surgery organization because that's who we had been up to that point? Or were we going to be agile and be able to pivot to tend to the current needs of what was happening in the country where we were living? And I remember a very serious conversation between us. It was like the organization has $80,000 in the bank, and that's what it's going to cost to complete the mission that we have planned to come in and heal these 24 children who had their name on the surgery list in the coming weeks. And we had to decide, were we going to push all that money to the center of the table and spend it on these children without knowing if we would even be in Iraq in 2 more weeks or not? And I remember standing in the kitchen with Jeremy, and it was just like, how can we not? How can we not? It doesn't matter that it's every cent we have and none of it may be paid back. All that matters is we've made a promise to these children, and we're not going to let a terrorist organization come in and take away their future. And so we did it. We went all in, we spent the money, and the surgeons came, and the children got their surgery, and it was amazing. And then the very next day, we gathered with our staff and said, are we going to do this thing? We don't know very much about aid, but we're here, and we know a lot about Iraq, and we're used to listening to government officials. We're used to listening to the people, and we actually could make a difference. And we could make a difference while other aid organizations are getting ready
because
and preparing
people were being
themselves
pushed out of their
arrive.
homes.
Yeah, people were living on the side of the road
And that
with
wasn't our
nothing,
work.
and we'd never done that before, but we knew we could learn how to do it. The expertise was out there. We just needed to figure it out. And I don't think it took even 5 minutes of conversation before the whole team put in to pivot and learn this new thing, give all of ourselves. And we have continued doing that for the last 3 years, just giving everything that we could to be able to see a change and a difference in in our neighborhoods, in the cities right around us.
Yeah, you said a couple of words there that I think are maybe surprising to a few people. You said our country, referring to Iraq, and you said something about, I don't know, you said something about local or neighbors or something. This has always been a local thing for us. This has always been, well, I guess after the first week or two, once we moved into a new country, eventually it just became our place. It became our people. It's where we live. Just like you have your place and your people and where you live. And I think that part of our journey has been about just staying awake to the needs around us. We happen to live in a place that has been particularly beset by conflict and war, but I don't know that that's the moral of the story. I think the moral of the story for us has always been more about how do we stay awake to the wonder of what's going on around us? How do you see the little girls like Seema writhing in the corner? How do you use your moments in a coffee shop to be present to the needs of the barista who might issue you, if you just ask for it, if you just welcome it, who might open up for you an opportunity to serve in a way that changes not only his life but your own life? And do we dare have our lives disrupted by the people around us?
Yeah, I think it would be a shame to be with you guys this weekend and for the takeaway to be they're doing amazing things in Iraq. I really believe that we have just been obedient to the things right in front of us where we live, and that's what we're all supposed to do, right? Is love what is right in front of us. And it would also be a shame if you walked away saying, wow, they're the heroes and they're making an incredible change where they live. We have been blessed upon blessed upon blessed and changed and forever transformed by the people that we get to live among and partner with to see this change. And I just was reading in Isaiah 58 this morning about the fast, and how the fast is to love the widow and care for the orphan and help the imprisoned. And there's some really important verses in there that I forget to think about the blessing that is promised to us and the way that God uses that to change us and bring us into a better place. And it's not that, and I don't think God does that divorced from the people that we get to be among. I think he uses the people that we're among to do that in us. I don't know, I just didn't want to miss that this morning. It's been really paramount on me as I miss telling the stories of my friends and missing them so much, how much they add to my life.
When we hang out after times like this, we're often asked for simple snippets of advice or whatever. And I think our favorite thing to say to friends like you who find any energy in a story like ours is to just say, take one scary step toward the thing that makes you most uncomfortable. Right after September 11th terror attacks, it was scary in some ways to dare to pray for Osama bin Laden. It was the tiniest of steps, but it was like a rudder on our ship that ended up sending us way in a different direction down our life. Raising our hands to move into Turkey. Turkey's an amazing country without much violence to speak of, but it was scary at the time. And then that wooed us further into Iraq, and then that wooed us further into conflict. And now as this whole thing is unfolded, we find ourselves on the front lines of bombs and snipers and kidnappings, and we're providing food and water and jobs for hundreds of thousands of people across Syria and Iraq. And it's been nothing but one step after another, and it's all been local to us. Ultimately, it's all been in the neighborhoods and the communities and the states where we live. And I just would offer that as an encouragement today. Like, what can you do where you already are that's just a little bit different than the way you've already been doing it? What's the one next step you can take? You don't have to solve the whole problem. Just take the one next step. But make sure it's scary. I mean, really, like, it's so easy to just stay local, stay in our neighborhoods, stay in our churches, and stay in our schools and not do anything that's ever different. And that's how we become so powerless in the world. And it's why we end up having such generational differences, because when you're young and you're in your early 20s, you think you know everything and you think you can change the world. And there's something so beautiful about that. But somehow by the time you reach middle age or you reach older age, you've had all the blows come against you and you give up on believing that anything can ever change. We quit doing scary things intentionally. We just settle into the way it's always been done. So I think we have to do scary. We have to move toward people who scare us. We have to move toward people who hold different views than us, politically, on policy, on identity, on the way they pray and worship. Like, we have to move toward people who scare us. Or we're just going to all end up looking and being the same. And we're going to get the same. And we're going to be calling out God for more blessing and more baptism and more power. But it's not going to ever change if we don't take some kind of scary step. And I think it's got to be a step. That's my last word. It's got to be a step. It's not only going to happen in here. It's got to be a step toward. It's got to be action-oriented. It's got to be service-oriented. It's got to be movement. The change doesn't happen if we just stay where we are. I just want to pray, Lord, please, for these friends and for us, all of us as a church today, animate us with your good spirit, with your love. Animate us, make us alive, live in us, move in and through us to take one scary step in Jesus' name to something that would challenge us, to something that would change us, to something that you might even use to get our fists down and get our arms open wide. Lord, make us a people who would dare to love first and ask questions later. And if the answers to the questions have already come in our life and we're already beaten up and beaten down and burdened under the pain of life, make us a people for this second half of life who would dare to love anyway. In spite of the pain, in spite of our doubts and our disbelief, animate us to love anyway. In Jesus' name.